A couple months ago, biohacker Brian Johnson posted this video of him doing a max effort leg press.
Press, lock it out.
And honestly, when I saw it, I was like, oh, great, good for him. But the internet had a absolutely mind-blowing panic attack, and so many people said something like, bro, you're only doing a half rep, it doesn't count. To include Andrew Huberman, who said, awesome, but friends don't let friends do partial reps. Now, I think Andrew was trying to be a little bit facetious and playful, and he meant it in good faith, but Brian took it poorly, there was some back and forth. Anyway, this is just a really interesting thing to me because I'm like, why are people freaking out about this concept of a half rep? So today I'm going to talk about why half reps, at least in the way the term is commonly used, aren't actually real, or at least on a conceptual level, don't actually make sense unless you're aware of a whole bunch of different things about someone's goals in an exercise. So let's dive into the biomechanics related to this topic and let's figure out kind of what makes more sense. So to illustrate this concept, I want to talk about two different variations of a squat. So here is squat variation number one. It looks like a traditional, awesome deep squat. And then here is squat variation number two, which to many of you probably looks like a deadlift, and it basically is. But many people, when they see these comparisons, will say, this one is good, and this one is bad, and we will call this a half rep, and we will call this a full rep. But in reality, there's much more to the picture here, and we could consider this full range of motion if only we could be more specific. All right, so now let's imagine two scenarios, one of which is to target the quads, and the second of which is to target the glutes. And let's assess these techniques in the context of targeting the quads. In this example, what you'll notice is that this person is getting a full knee bend, right? So the quads, which surround the front side of this joint, basically are as stretched as they're going to get, at least 3 of the 4, because one of them crosses the hip. And in this scenario over here, the knee is pretty much at a 90-degree angle, right? So the quads aren't fully lengthened, and when the person gets to the bottom of this motion, they still have a lot of range, as is demonstrated here, to more lengthen the quads and make this exercise more quad biased. Now, obviously, this variation will still include some quads, and this variation will still include some glutes, but the farther that the knee moves forward, and the more that the knee is simultaneously bent and forward away from the feet, the more quad biased the motion. So if we look at these two, we would say, okay, yeah, that's kind of a half rep looking thing if our goals are to target the quads, at least just on a generalized level. However, let's imagine an alternative scenario, which is a perfectly viable common goal of targeting the glutes instead of targeting the quads. Well, what do we need to fully lengthen the glutes, the glute max specifically? Well, we need to fully bend the hips, and this is, pretty much as bent as anyone is going to get their hips. They just bring their femur up to a point where it stops moving upward. Boom, the glutes are fully stretched in this context. If we look over in this context, look, similar hip angle, glutes are fully stretched. So in this example, the quads, as we went over, are really stretched and the glutes are really stretched, right? So you have a good combination of both of these things. If we look at this example, however, the glutes are fully stretched, again, same hip angle, but the big difference here is the knees, right? And specifically how much the knee is bent. And something interesting happens when we change the degree of knee bend that's beyond just changing the length of the quads. So in this example on the left, what happens when the knee travels farther forward is that if we picture, okay, this is the line of resistance, the green going up from the feet, the distance from the resistance to the knee, in other words, a moment arm, and this is something that I talk about literally every single day inside my mentorship. Check the link in the description below if you're interested in that. But basically, this distance is a representation of how much resistance is on the knee, aka how much resistance our quads have to act against. And similarly, this line right here represents the resistance on the glutes, right? Because here's the hip joint, here's the knee joint. And what you can see is that this is a much more of a quad dominant variation. So even though we have the glutes fully stretched out here, and we're only looking at one position, so this is somewhat limited of an analysis, but hopefully the point remains clear here, that in the bottom position where we have to deal with the most amount of resistance to overcome out of the bottom, right? The bottom is the hardest part. There's a much longer distance to the knee compared to the hip. So again, we label this as quad dominant. But if we look at this variation over here, and we imagine, okay, where is the force direction? Well, it's somewhere roughly up through the foot there. Look at how much bigger the distance is to the hip here as compared to the knee. Again, what I'm drawing are moment arms. This relates to the whole concept of torque. Again, if you want to learn more about that, I have just hours and hours and hours of content inside the mentorship about this. But when we look at this example over here, what we'll notice is look at this line here to the hip, and then look at this line here, right? And look at this line here compared to this line here. What you'll notice is that this is much less quad dominant than this is hip dominant. So ultimately what I'm getting at here is that when we do a squat like this, people will conceptualize this as a half rep. And you might be able to say that in the context where we've clearly defined what a full range rep is. When we're talking about half reps versus full reps, we need to do so in relation to what we're actually trying to do in an exercise. And in this variation, someone might have a goal of specifically training the glutes and not training the quads. Maybe they're training their quads on, the next training day, or maybe they just trained their quads 2 days ago and their quads are sore, and the way they've organized their training is such that they want to make this a really powerful glute dominant variation. So this would be an instance where this is much more glute dominant than this is knee dominant, right? Because this person is going to come up out of the bottom, their hips are probably going to shoot backward a little bit. So this is kind of going to end up being a quad glute hybrid, whereas this is going to be like 80 to 90% glutes and very, very minimal quad. So in other words, this is just a fantastic variation for training the glutes. Why? Well, because number one, we have this full hip bend that we talked about, fully stretching out the glutes. And then number two, we have a resistance from the floor based on all of our joint positions and the way that they're arranged. That makes it so that so much resistance is on the hips and a very, very small amount, especially in comparison to this, is on the knee. So we end up saying, okay, this is basically a glute and also adductor. If you're familiar with that muscle, it's a big adductor muscle that also will contribute to this kind of motion. This is a fantastic variation for training your glutes. And so if we look at the Brian Johnson leg press scenario, what we basically see is this variation of a squat just done in a leg press, right? If you turn this over onto its side and you compared it to the Brian Johnson leg press and the way that he was doing it, yeah, he has a lot more hip bend than knee bend, but his hips are basically as fully bent as they can get. And you can tell just based on the way that his butt almost is going to come up, right? Because his hips are running out of range of motion to actually move backward. And so that's a fantastic variation for training the hips in a specifically hip dominant leg press. So if you just in a kind of blanket way label that as a half rep, you are automatically dismissing the potential utility of performing a variation that way. So just to show you all a very simple example with Frank here, my skeleton, of what I mean, if someone is doing a leg press like this, right, and their end range position looks kind of like this, right, look at how bent the hips are. I mean, in this model, my skeleton is basically like running into itself with bone on bone, right, so the leg may need to kind of flare slightly outward. Right, if someone finishes a leg press like this, a lot of what people are looking at is the superficial representation of the foot plate and how much the foot plate is moving. So people will arbitrarily define shoving your knee like this just to simply get the foot plate farther forward as full range of motion, and they will define something like this as a partial rep or a half rep. Now, if someone's using a leg press where they're able to kind of scoot more forward here, right, maybe this is kind of where they end up. But again, if we think about, okay, well, what is the resistance trying to do to the leg here? Well, if it's coming through a foot plate and we assume it's kind of just shooting through the shin here and directly into the femur, the foot plate is trying to shove the femur upward like this. And so we just simply ask ourselves, well, what is really good at moving the femur forward and downward like this? Your glute max muscle, which sits right underneath here. Again, also that adductor muscle that I mentioned earlier. So if a leg press is smushing our leg like this, and this is as far as we're getting, well, the hip is fully bent, the glutes are fully stretched, and there's a maximal amount of resistance on the hip. How is that a half rep, right? Relative to the goal of training the glutes. It's a full rep, fantastic, A+. Now, if our goals were to train our quads, would we want our knees to be this bent? More than likely, probably not, right? So what's the solution to that? Is the solution to that to simply just jam your leg farther this way? No, it's to put your foot lower on the platform so that the platform can instead attempt to be bending your knee. So if you think about, okay, what happens when I move the foot lower? And this is, I love a variation where you actually are just putting the balls of your feet on the leg press, because a lot of leg presses, they're not set up to make it super easy to do a quad dominant variation. So what I like to do is I put the balls of my feet on the bottom of the leg press, and I get to a point where I'm basically moving this far. So the foot plate, yes, it will move from here, being all the way over here, to now the foot plate is closer. But is that better? Well, if our goals are to train the knee, yeah, it's probably better for training the knee, but not in any absolute blanket sense. So if the foot plate is now down here, think about, okay, well, what is the direction that the foot plate is shoving the foot? Well, the foot plate is basically shoving the ankle to the butt. And if the ankle is being shoved to the butt, what is really good at undoing that, right? At basically shoving the foot forward against something? Muscles that surround the knee. Why? Number one, well, because the knee is fully bent, the quads are fully stretched. And number two, because the resistance is angled such that it's really far away from the knee, kind of like we showed in that knee dominant variation. So again, whether you put your foot high, whether you put your foot low, whether you put your foot somewhere in between, how much or how little the leg press platform actually moves, right? All of that needs to be considered within the box of what the hell am I trying to do? If we don't have reference to that, then we don't know where we should put our feet. We don't know how far back or forward we should move. We don't know what angle our torso and our hips should be set at before we even start the leg press. We don't know how much range of motion we should use. All those questions are still open questions outside the context of a goal. So the point being, if you see someone doing a leg press that you don't like visually, just on a superficial level, you should ask yourself, well, what might the utility of this variation be? You should not jump straight to, oh, this is a half rep and therefore I'm going to dismiss it as something that is potentially valuable in specific contexts. Now, to be honest, a lot of this stuff can be super confusing, which is why I have so much content inside my mentorship dedicated specifically to understanding these kinds of concepts and all the biomechanics that you could possibly want to know related to the weight room and growing muscle and getting stronger. So again, if you're interested in that, check out the link in the description. You'll be able to learn directly from me, to ask me specific questions, post specific videos for feedback, and a lot of other good stuff.